We've looked at the main modern moral theories of ethics that really dominated in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Uh, Immanuel Kant's deontological approach that emphasizes duty and the categorical comparative, trying to determine a universal law that's binding on all people, morally speaking, and acknowledging the dignity of all people, that they can't be used as means, but only as ends. At John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, emphasizing pleasure as the object of all of our pursuits, and that an object is good because of the consequences of it tending to bring about pleasure or happiness, as he calls it, where everybody is counted equally, though if social expediency requires it, we can, as it were, set aside people's rights. But then we saw that really going back to the late 19th century and more dominantly, say after World War II, that while these two moral theories were the main ones that you would have gotten, say, at a college or a university, well into the 1960s, 1970s, and even somewhat beyond, there was also these opposing views of a kind of relativistic approach, subjectivism as it might be called, that whereas Kant and Mill think there is an objective morality, that there are actions that are morally right or wrong for all people at all times, and that's not a matter of human decision. Nietzsche, and then much later Sartre, reject this and think that if there is no God, then there can't be a morality that's binding on all people, and that instead what we get is a relativistic or a subjective morality that starts with human choice and with our deciding for ourselves what values we want to have, what things we want to hold up for ourselves as models of living. And there's a kind of individualism there that's dominant, that each of us has to have our own moral theory or moral system or values by which to live, because there is nothing in common that can bind all of this together. And I think it's fair to say that this view, some form of relativism or postmodernism, as we could call this, or is very common and perhaps even dominant in public life, especially in colleges and universities, that generally when we go to classes or get the authorities speaking about morality, they're going to emphasize that forming of values, having our own maybe dreams and perspectives, and that there isn't anything that is good for all people, but instead we should maybe maximize freedom so that each person can decide for themselves how they want to live or choose the identity that they have. So we seem to be kind of stuck in this, that either you get an objective approach to ethics that for many is unsatisfying, either the duty approach or the pleasure approach, or a relativism that has some pretty difficult consequences, as Jean-Paul Sartre himself speaks about, that anguish and abandonment and despair. And seeing this too in someone like Kierkegaard, with the idea that life becomes boredom, that the basic fact of human life is trying to overcome the boredom of being in a meaningless universe. So in the midst of all of this, an amazing and really transformative approach to ethics came in that was really a bringing back of a previous view, something that came from before the modern period, called virtue ethics. So we're going to look in this lecture at the text or the book that really launched this revolution, and then look at the basics of virtue ethics itself as an option that is neither that modern option of Kant or Mill, in some ways it combines them, and not a subjective or personal or relativistic approach that we get in the modern, but also has aspects of that as well. So we could say this virtue ethics approach, those who are proponents of it think that it's restoring a unity that was broken up in the modern period. So go ahead and look. You can you can download this, or you can just watch on in the lecture here, that toward at the end of our text, we have MacIntyre, a disquieting suggestion, and then MacIntyre, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Benedict. So we'll look at both of these. So first of all, we will start with disquieting suggestion from Alistair MacIntyre. So Alistair MacIntyre writes this book after Virtue, and it really does change everything. I mean, this is before my time, but my mentors told me that unless you were at some liberal arts colleges, especially if they were Christian, or especially if they were Catholic, you would have gotten Kant or Mill, and that, Kant or Mill, and then maybe got introduced to Nietzsche, but that you would not have been exposed to virtue ethics, to specifically to Aristotle, and that Alistair MacIntyre changed this with this book. And so one thing I do want to just mention about Alistair MacIntyre as well is that he still lectures. So he, as far as I know, will be lecturing again at Notre Dame in the fall of 2023. And this book came out in 1981, so we think, we're going back some 40 years. Alistair MacIntyre's first teaching job was in 1951. So Alistair MacIntyre has been doing this for a long time. He's from England, and he was first a Marxist. So he first, had this strong, that he was committed to the Marxist cause, and then later on adopts this after this virtue ethics approach, and launches this restoration of virtue ethics from this ancient period. And I'm sorry, I'm looking this up right now, that he was actually born in Scotland, excuse me. So he's born in Scotland, not England. Okay, so what's MacIntyre's argument here? I'm not going to go through the whole text here, but he has this this great image here. It's worth reading this in the beginning, kind of fable. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur, laboratories are burnt down, the physicists are lynched, books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there is a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. But all they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance. Parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment. Instruments whose use has been forgotten. Half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody or almost nobody realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. For everything that they do and say conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, in those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they're doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. So he goes on from here. And if you know of the book by Walter Miller, one of the great post-apocalyptic novels, A Canticle for Leibowitz, you can see, I would assume, an influence here from that book. What MacIntyre is asking us to envision then is a world in which science has been lost. There's an attempt to recover it, but what they're getting is fragments, and ones that are from various theories that have been built up over hundreds of years and that are incompatible with one another. Phlogiston theory, which is an old theory, and say quantum mechanics or another theory. And so they're not aware of this. And he thinks that this is essentially what has happened in ethics. that there was an older tradition or theory of ethics that was at the foundation of our moral positions and of moral principles, but that theory has been lost. And we still have those moral principles or moral arguments that are still capable of being aired. And yet we are always talking past one another because we don't fully understand the basics of it. Notice that in some ways this sounds like Nietzsche's death of God idea, that, you know, God is dead and people are still using this morality that no longer has a foundation. MacIntyre is saying something similar, but he's not referring to Christianity or to religion. He's referring to the previous virtue ethics tradition. And so going back to the article here, this preface to it, MacIntyre goes on to talk about how this is essentially what's going on here. And it would seem like this is preposterous. I mean, we have such good history. We have such good knowledge of the texts that were important in these ages of history, going back at least to the Greeks. So how do we not know this? And he says that part of this, which I think is a compelling argument, was very convincing. A lot of people recognize this. So let me find the passage here. Yeah, so surely he says, I mean, again, this objection that if this had happened, that there was a catastrophe in moral theory, we would know this because we have this history that shows us the, you know, the development of morality over the last 2,500 plus years. But MacIntyre has, I think, a very good rejoinder to this. Sorry, I got to find the passage here. Okay, right here, page 4. History by now in our culture means academic history, and academic history is less than 2 centuries old. Suppose it were the case that the catastrophe of which my hypothesis speaks had occurred before, or largely before, the founding of academic history, so that the moral and other evaluative presuppositions of academic history derive from the forms of the disorder which it brought about. Suppose, that is, that the standpoint of academic history is such that its value-neutral viewpoint, moral disorder, must largely remain invisible. All that the historian, what is true of the historian, is characteristically true of also of the social scientist, will be allowed to proceed by the canons and categories of his discipline, will be one morality succeeding another: Puritanism, hedonism, work ethic, and so on. And so MacIntyre's point then is that history, as we understand it, really means this academic history, the history that takes place in colleges and universities, and that approach to history is itself biased against this older tradition. That the academic history takes a value-neutral stance, saying that history is not supposed to have a moral position on things. It's simply there to report what has happened. And as a result, then, it can't see the underlying theory that was behind all of the different positions held up in previous cultures. So what MacIntyre thinks we need to do then is, in this world of after virtue, is we need to go back and retrieve parts of the tradition that we've lost. Now, to use an image I think that we can relate to, perhaps, is that you ever have the experience where you're driving, and now with phones and the Google Maps, we maybe don't have this happen so often, but we're driving somewhere and we realize we've taken a wrong turn. But rather than go back, we just think to ourselves, maybe if I just keep going in this direction, I'll find an alternate way to get to where I'm going. And there's a kind of humility that's necessary there to admit that we took a wrong turn. I need to turn around and go back to that previous place in order to move forward in the right direction. And this, MacIntyre argues, is what we need to do in morality. So before looking at the main virtue text itself, it'd be worth adding one more aspect to all of this from MacIntyre, is that towards the end of his book, he poses it very starkly. That we have two options before us: Nietzsche or Aristotle, Trotsky, and St. Benedict. That either we get some form of Nietzschean relativism, where there's no basis for morality, there's no God, there's no objectivity, or Aristotle, or we go to Aristotle as someone who can provide us with an account of morality that can stand up to some of the modern criticisms. And he concludes, again, that we have to make a choice, that all of us have to choose either some form of relativism in the godless universe or the objective standpoint of nature that Aristotle gets us, that claims to, be a foundation for ethics. And he's got a very pessimistic view that if we're going to do this seriously, it might require something drastic. So it's worth reading this. It is always dangerous to draw too precise parallels between one historical period and another. And among most misleading of such parallels are those which have been drawn between our own age in Europe and North America and the epoch in which the Roman Empire declined into the Dark Ages. Nonetheless, certain parallels there are. A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Empire, Imperium, and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that empire. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we ought also conclude that for some time now, we too have reached that turning point. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. It is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. And so, being a Benedictine school, we should recognize there's something amazing here about his call to look to Saint Benedict and to the Benedictine tradition. And what does he mean by that? Well, that at the end of the Roman Empire, and if you took the listening seminar, hopefully you encountered, this narrative from the life of Saint Benedict, that as the Roman Empire collapsed, which the last Roman emperor was in 476, was removed just 4 years before Saint Benedict died or was born, that Saint Benedict is living in Rome and sees the moral decay and the general cultural decay all around him, flees the city of Rome, goes out into the desert, and ends up almost unintentionally attracting to himself people who see as well that we need to abandon this collapsing empire. And so they form communities out in the wild that are rooted in the life of the virtues, the life of prayer, and a kind of self-sustaining farming model. And that these small local communities became the places in which people could, as it were, go to school in the virtues, get a formation in good character. And that over time led to the flourishing of Europe, to the rise of schools and universities, and to the towns that were formed around the monasteries and so forth. So MacIntyre thinks that we are at an age where that might be what we need to do, that our civilization is collapsing, that there are serious threats, that, as he puts it, the barbarians are already ruling us. And so what we need to do is not necessarily go out into the desert or go out into the woods, although that may be one way of doing it, but of forming communities, perhaps within even a city, in which we have intentional communities of people who practice civility and the formation of good character, and perhaps forming schools together and co-ops and other ways of a kind of living that, while they might be in the midst of the large, kind of technocratic paradigm of which we are a part, that they are seeking something that is, coming forward from the tradition to meet the new challenges of the day. Okay, all that is a preface to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, because this is where MacIntyre wants to direct our attention. He thinks, again, that we have an option, two choices, Nietzsche or Aristotle. So we've encountered Nietzsche. We've seen versions of Nietzsche in Sartre and in crop rotation, and now we're going to spend a significant portion of the class in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and seeing this alternative. Perhaps you've already read book 1 and maybe even book 2 of the ethics in the listening seminar, and then if you took the learning seminar as well. So some of this will be a refresher, but I think having this context of the other moral theories and of this return to virtue ethics will really enrich your understanding of the text and will be coming across things you hadn't noticed before. So I'm going to work through passages from book 1 of the ethics to give us this basic foundation. And then we will look at later books in the future. But so make sure you have this, you have your copy of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics with you. And I really want to impress upon us that what Aristotle gives us is a moving viewpoint, where he's going to, okay, so Kant begins with duty, right? That using reason to do our duty. Mill begins with our pursuit of pleasure. Aristotle, we could say, begins with an introspective stance where we look at our own pursuits. In some sense, our desires, the ones that we're conscious, you know, that we seek food and pleasures, various things, but also the natural drive that humans have for various ways of living or for various kinds of relationships and of objects to pursue. To start from that, and as we build up the argument about what it is that we're after, we will continue, almost think of it as like climbing mountain peaks, and then we get to one thinking we're at the top, and then we realize that there's another one further, and so forth, is that as we move through this account and through these arguments, we will come to a deeper understanding in each case of what is the human life that is worth living, that we are all seeking. So he begins on page 1 with a very famous line: every craft and every discipline, and likewise action, decision, seem to seek some good. That is why some people were right to describe the good as what everything seeks. So the word good here is not some word we're going to get from science or something we're going to define up front as a kind of, you know, objective thing that's out there. Rather, we're going to start with the good as this natural drive that we have to seek things. And so the word good simply means whatever we seek. That is what is good. And he goes on, but the ends appear to differ. For some are activities and others are products apart from the activities. And where there are ends apart from the actions, the products are by nature better than the activities. So he's now then introducing that there are different kinds of goods, though. There are actions or activities we perform, there are products that we seek. And so there are different goods that we're after, and we need to prioritize them. We need to recognize that whenever we're pursuing something, there's some other thing we could be pursuing, and that we are choosing this rather than another good because we think this good is higher. And so some goods then are higher than others. What makes them higher? Well, he goes on with this example of bridle making and horsemanship and so forth to say what makes a good higher than another is that it is more final as an end. So we make bridles, we make stirrups, we make holsters, we make all of these objects to make horsemanship more fine-tuned and more refined and more excellent. And so horsemanship is the good we're really seeking when we seek to make crafts items for riding horses. But then in turn, riding the horse is something we do as a means to a higher end. Now, they used horses in war, and that's not something we necessarily do today, although we're familiar with this, of course, that you learn how to ride a horse so that you can win battles in war. And then from there, we ask, well, why do we want to win battles in war? And we have to keep going. And so the good that we're seeking is not just one. There are many kinds of goods. So the question is, can we compare all these goods, or are we stuck, which would lead us back to Nietzsche with, well, they're just different goods for different people, and they can't really be compared. But he goes on to say, in chapter 2, still at the bottom of page 1, if then the things achievable by action have some end that we wish for because of itself, and we wish for the other things because of this end, we do not choose everything because of something else. For if we do, it will go on without limit, so that desire will prove to be empty and futile. It is clear then that this end will be the good, that is to say, the best good. So Aristotle's argument here then is that our human desire is for a good that is final, that includes the other kinds of goods, that allows us to rest in that good and to have a satisfaction. So since there is that desire that we find for rest, for joy, for satisfaction, for finality, if there weren't some good that provided that satisfied that desire, then our desires would be empty, they'd be futile. And so two problems with that. First of all, then we could never have any real satisfaction, because we recognize that we pursue one good to have another good, that good for another one, and for another good, and maybe that goes back in a circle, that there's never any actual good that completes the journey. And so there'd be something lacking. The second thing is that this desire we have for a final good is in us. And how do we explain its presence in us unless it is rooted in something that is true and that is real, namely that there is a good for which humans long. And so the question is, what is that good? So he's going to go on from there in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 to talk about politics, and his understanding of politics or political science is a little different from ours. He's really thinking of political science is that art of governing or of helping a community to pursue that highest good that humans are striving for. You know, kind of think of things like peace and harmony and stable relationships, friendships, and so forth. And from there, now he's going to really turn his attention back to ethics. And telling us that this is something about ethics as he approaches it. So notice Kant and Mill don't really demand any kind of character formation from you. They just say, well, you know, just these rules of morality, you know, pursuing pleasure or pursuing duty, that anyone at any time, if they just follow this kind of like scientific method of ethics, can achieve. But Aristotle would say, ethics isn't like that. Ethics is an art. There's an art of living. There's a scientific aspect to ethics, but what we're really interested in is living well, and living well is an art, right? That there's an art of good living. And so teaching ethics without having that character formation would be like teaching dance without actually doing the moves. That yes, in a sense, you can know how to dance simply by learning the rules and learning, you know, the principles of who leads who, but to really say you know what dance is to say that you can practice it yourself. And so at the end of chapter 3, Aristotle makes this point that you might not like. We'll see. This is first full paragraph on page 3. This is why a youth is not a suitable student of political science, for he lacks experience of the actions in life, which are the subject and premises of our argument. So you need experience in actions. Moreover, since he tends to follow his feelings, his study will be futile and useless, since the goal is action, not knowledge. We're not interested in ethics to know what the principles are. We're interested in ethics to know how to be good, to actually put them into practice and to perform good actions. So unless you're willing to guide your desires by reason, which is a formation that takes place over many years, you won't profit from a study of ethics. And so virtue ethics then emphasizes this having good character, okay? So he goes on from there to talk about what most people think the human good is. And over the bottom of page 3, pleasure, wealth, or honor. that these are the things people pursue. And we've encountered especially pleasure in the class already as a way of life that people pursue. And so he makes this point that pleasure seeking is essentially living the animal part of our souls, that animals pursue pleasure. The good that we're after is not the kind of good that a cow can achieve or the kind of good that a dog can achieve, even though it might have something analogous to that. And so pleasure can't be the good because animals can have that. And when we get pleasure, we're, again, not really satisfying what's distinctly human about us. Honor can't be happiness either, because honor is something we get as a result of having the good, so that people honor us because they think we are good, because we've done good things. And the good that we're after is not something someone else can bestow on us. It's something that we ourselves will have. So honor can't be happiness. And then finally, wealth. That one's pretty easy, because wealth is something we want as a means to an end, something that by having it, we're able to pursue some other thing we want. And yet we've already said the human good we're after is not a means, but an end in itself. It's the sort of thing that is worth having for its own sake. So skipping to chapter 7, on pages 8 and following, Aristotle tells us that the good that we're after is this human good, right? Not just any old good. The most complete and final human good has a name that we all use, even if we're not sure what it is: happiness. In the Greek, it's eudaimonia. And in English, we use the word happiness to mean that state that we can be in which we lack nothing. So that if I'm happy in the full sense of the word, then I am complete and I have a self-sufficiency about me. Whereas something like comfort has something like that, but comfort is more like, if I can't be happy, comfort's not so bad. I suppose we could put it this way, that being comfortable is a way of saying, yeah, I'm comfortable in my couch and my lazy chair, or whatever it may be, but I still am seeking for something. Whereas happiness has this finality to it. And so again, it's complete in that our lives are lacking in nothing when we have it. It's also self-sufficient, although it's important to recognize this is page 9 in paragraph 6 there, that what we mean by self-sufficiency, he says, is not what suffices for a solitary person by himself, living an isolated life, but what suffices also for parents, children, wife, and in general for friends and fellow citizens, since a human being is a naturally political animal. Important point here, that because humans are the kind of creatures that achieve their good as members of families, of communities, that self-sufficiency, which is, happiness is self-sufficient, doesn't mean living alone on an island, or being my own person on my, as a unique individual who just happens to share space or activities with people. It means being a friend, being a brother, a sister, a mother, a daughter, etc., and being a citizen, being someone who practices a kind of patriotism or a care for the community. And so that's the sort of good that we are after. So now after this, he goes back to, he's going to go to an argument that really is important in this question of Aristotle or Nietzsche, which is often called the function argument. What he wants us to think about is whether or not humans have a function. Another word we might use, and we've used so far this semester, is a purpose. Is there something for which we are here, some task or some reason why humans are here? And he doesn't mean in the sense of a God who has, guiding us in providence, makes us an image and likeness. He means, is there something about being rational, political creatures like us that gives us a function or a kind of characteristic activity, as he puts it? So let's read this at the bottom of page 9. Paragraph 9. But presumably the remark that the best good is happiness is apparently something generally agreed, and we still feel the need of a clear statement of what the best good is. Perhaps then we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, i.e. doing well for a flautist, a sculptor, and every craftsman, And in general, for whatever has a function and characteristic action seems to depend on its function. The same seems to be true for a human being, if a human being has some function. Then do the carpenter and the leather worker have their functions and actions, but has a human being no function? Is he by nature idle without any function? Or just as eye, hand, foot, and in general every bodily part apparently has its function, may we likewise ascribe to human beings some function apart from all of these? Okay, so by function here, we simply mean a kind of action or activity that characterizes the kind of thing something is. So let me give an example. A clock. When we call something a clock, we don't simply mean an object that looks a certain way. And one way of recognizing that is that there are lots of ways clocks can look. You know, they can have two hands, they can be numbers, we can have a sand, you know, like the name here, a sand dial, or, you know, a timekeeping in various kinds of ways. We can use our watch for this. But they're still all a clock. So the clock is not the configuration of parts or the kind of look that something has. Another indication of that is that something could have all of the proper parts, but if there's something wrong with the relationship between those parts, it won't accurately tell time. And there's a certain point in which if you have a clock that is no longer able to keep time, even though it has all of the motions of a clock, it ceases really to be a clock, because to call something a clock is to say that it is an object that performs the function of keeping time. And so again, functions worked into it, that when somebody says this is a clock, what they mean is that it is good at telling time or good for telling time. Similarly with a musician, he uses the flautist example. So imagine that, you know, you hire you're having a party or you're having a wedding, and you hire a musician to perform at this event. And he says, I'm a guitarist. So he shows up at the party and he just starts playing that guitar, you know, willy-nilly without any rhyme or melody. He doesn't sing, you know, in any discernible sense. And you say, what is this? I said, you know, I needed a musician. You said you're a musician. He says, yeah, I'm a guitarist. I'm playing the guitar. You recognize that the meaning of the word guitarist is not simply strumming on the notes on the strings. It's playing it in a certain way, playing it well, or doing a good job. And that accounts for example, if you play an instrument just for fun, if someone says, are you a guitarist? You might say, well, I mean, I played the guitar, you know, I played a little bit, but I'm not really a guitarist, because a guitarist is a word we reserve to someone who has a certain kind of excellence at it. So Aristotle is saying then that all things have a function, an action that they perform that flows from their nature. And so humans too have an action that they should perform, something that is good for them and that is the ethical, north, pole that we're striving for. So let's read on here at the top of page 10. What then could this be? What is this function? For living is apparently shared with plants. But what we are looking for is the special function of a human being. Hence, we should set aside the life of nutrition and growth. The next life in order is some sort of life of sense perception. But this too is apparently shared with horse, ox, and every animal. So that can't be the good we're after or the happiness we're seeking. The remaining possibility then is some sort of life of action of the part of the soul that has reason. One part of it has reason as obeying reason, the other has it as itself having reason and thinking. Moreover, life is also spoken of in two ways, as capacity and as activity. We must take a human being's special function to be life as activity, since this seems to be called life more fully. We have found then the human function as activity of the soul in accord with reason or requiring reason. Okay, so when we're sleeping, we are still human. If you disagree with that, you're led to all sorts of moral situations, right? That if someone's not human when they're sleeping, then it wouldn't be murder to kill them. So even though someone is not doing properly human activities when they're asleep, they're still human. But we recognize then the full sense of the word, when we say someone's human, we really mean a certain kinds of activity people perform. And that's why when someone behaves in a grossly immoral fashion, we say things like, you dog, or what a beast, or he's not a man. That we see someone who acts in an irrational, inhuman, uncaring way as being, yes, a human, in terms of the capacity they have for action, but yet not a human in terms of activity. You could have great fun thinking about things like zombies and whether a zombie would be a human, or more true to life, coma, right? If someone's in a coma and there's a lot of very difficult moral issues there surrounding people in comas, and when does death occur? When is somebody dead? So the activity that we're looking for then is not simply being here. It's not simply living, despite what some popular bumper stickers say, live simply that others may simply live. It's not simply living. It's not having emotions and passions, because animals have that. It is a life of reason. And so he sketches out then that the kind of thing that we're looking for, that is happiness, is performing function. In paragraph 15, he lays this out. Now, each function is completed well by being completed in accord with the virtue proper to that kind of thing. This new word, virtue, key word here. And so the human good, or happiness, here's our definition of happiness, proves to be activity of the soul in accord with virtue, and indeed in accord with the best and most complete virtue, if there are more virtues than one, and further in a complete life. For one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one day, nor similarly does one day or a short time make us blessed and happy. So what is happiness then? Happiness is acting in accordance with virtue, which requires, a rational, a reason guiding our actions and our formation as people. Since there are different kinds of virtues that we need to figure out what are the most complete virtues, or perhaps there's one virtue that is the most complete, and he'll get into that later. And then over the course of a complete life, that someone who had a great childhood, or a great, they were star of the football team in high school, or something along those lines, we can't really call that happiness. That happiness has to be performing these virtuous activities, living in accordance with our function as rational political animals throughout the course of one's life as a whole. And as we'll see, if you have virtues, these are very stable things. And so those who practice the virtues in general retain them for life, because it's not simply about, Kant and Mill have this kind of imply that being ethical is just about making the right decision in a certain circumstance. That Aristotle would say that really being ethical has to do with being a certain kind of person who has the habit of knowing the right thing to do. Again, something like the dancer who just knows what the right move is, knows how to work with the partner, knows how to move to this song, or in this place, or in this setting, because of this character that this person has here. Okay, so he goes on to here talk about how to achieve happiness, and can we have it during our lifetime. There's kind of some interesting puzzles here about, since happiness is living a complete life and pursuing complete good, given that our lives aren't really complete until we die, can we be happy? And this is an issue we will return to when we look at Christian responses to virtue ethics that tend to, on the one hand, agree with the virtue ethics approach, but think that it's incomplete because it doesn't take up the issue of what happens after we die, or of things like faith, hope, and charity. Okay. On page 18 and following, Introduction to the Virtues, this is basically what, in the ancient world is called psychology, that he's really providing an account of the various powers that we have within us that guide our action. At the top, we have reason. So reason guides our action. And that reason also has a kind of second part of it, a kind of part of us that can listen to reason and kind of carry out orders, but itself doesn't reason. So think of that. This is sort of like the way we talk about the will, right? That I reason to myself, I should get up early tomorrow morning, and then I have this power of my will that follows the reason. It can't itself reason, but tries to adhere to reason. Aristotle's got, it's a little different, but something like that. And then he goes on from there to talk about two different kinds of passions that also guide us. We have things called irascible appetites or passions, that are passions for overcoming danger, overcoming things that prevent us from achieving the good, and ones that make us retreat in the face of challenges to the good. So think of passions and emotions like fear and daring come to mind. Hope would also be in there. Then finally, there are what are called concupiscible appetites. These are just basic bodily pleasures. So food, drink, sex, sleep, and so forth, that there are passions there. And so what he's going to do in book 2, which we are going to turn to for next time, is that in book 2, he's going to go over the kinds of virtue, recognizing that these powers of our soul, reasoning and passions, need to be tuned to each other, need to be brought into agreement and harmony with one another, and that we use the word virtue to indicate that state of our soul, sort of like tuning up the engine that allows us to act in accordance with our function. That when we have the virtues, we can act rightly. When we don't have the virtues, we're not tuned properly and so can't do the right things. So he's going to go through the kinds of virtues, give an explanation of what kind of thing virtue is, define virtue, give us some examples of various kinds of virtues to help, give us an understanding of what's meant by virtue. And then he's going to wrap up book 2 by looking at practical advice for each of us to achieve virtue if we find ourselves, away from that mean that we are striving to achieve. So I hope this introduction to book 1, for a lot of you, this is probably a refresher, but I hope you can see that Aristotle really is providing us with something that brings in many ways together pieces of those modern theories and unites them in a way that, at least for those who are convinced by virtue ethics, gives a unity in our humanity, of our real experience of pursuing a good life and forming a character so that we can be happy, that is missing in those modern accounts. So I look forward to continuing the discussion with you as we move forward in Aristotle's account of pursuing the human good.